Father Paul Watson is the founder of the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement. He was born in Millington in Maryland. Now, what's very important about that is he was born into an Episcopalian family. His father was actually an Episcopalian priest. Now, his father was known for the debates that he got into at Oxford, in the Oxford movement. Who was the primate? Was there really necessary for the church to have a pope, the number one person? Were we all supposed to be in reference to him or not? And Father Paul's father got so much into the debate that they said that he was a papist and he was actually a Jesuit in disguise, which is kind of a funny thing. But born out of this whole life of faith and study and scriptures, Father Paul was also living during a time that was of terrible pain. On the day that he was born, the newspaper headlines talked about the skirmishes of the Civil War. He was born in a time where everybody knew somebody that had been lost during war. So he knew what division meant. And living that intense division in a family that was supposed to be about promoting God's gospel, it just rubbed him the wrong way. So from his childhood, from his very beginnings, it was very faith-centered, it was very scriptural-centered. But his experience, day by day, was a great contrast of what he felt God was calling us to. So I would believe that even from his early days, he had a strong sense of God speaking to him through the scriptures to call him to a place of unity, to bridging that gap between people, that gap that led people to divisions. And Father Paul, from the beginning, had this great call to be radical. Even in his readings and his writings, in the very first contact between Mother Lorena and Father Paul, they wrote of something different. They saw that they wanted to be in a life that was different. There was something that was calling to them. So Mother Lorena writes back to him, well, do you know of an Episcopalian community, an Anglican community that lives corporate poverty? And Father Paul says no. And so in this writing back and forth, they keep testing what they feel they're called to. And it keeps leading them to refine themselves towards a radical nature. So they decide together, we need to find a community that lives in corporate poverty, follows a Franciscan model. And then Father Paul did this thing that Francis did. They call it throwing the lots of the saints, where the idea was you open the scriptures 3 times and you see what inspires you. How does God speak to you? So just as Francis did that during his times of discernment, one of the times he opens the scriptures, it says, we joy in God through whom we have received the atonement, the at-one-ment. As he meditated on it more, it wasn't what we think of today as atonement. It was bringing at one dynamically in time. So that sense of unity, once again, was brought up to him. In the other scriptures that he looked at, is that all may be one. That was another oneness. It kept coming through the readings, so he felt really called to this place of, can I be radically someone who is out there witnessing to oneness? And so from that, the community was founded, and there was this sense of, we need to be people who have a voice and use it to call God's people to unity, which was Jesus' prayer, that all may be one. Father Paul Watson and Mother Lorena White, they originally founded our community, the Society of the Atonement, in the Episcopalian tradition. Bit by bit, their call seemed to be for this sense of bringing the church back to a wholeness. So, as was so important to Father Paul, witness was the key element. And he said, we can't just do this, just talking about it, writing about it, blogging about it, whatever, that's not enough. When are we going to get to a point where we do something about it? So his first inspiration was right here at this very spot where we're sitting right now. He started to pray for Christian unity. And he said, this isn't just good enough if we're just sitting here. Let's reach out and let's ask the Pope if he would participate with us. So there have been many other weeks of prayer before that, but this was the first time that the Pope had responded back and said, yes, this is something we need to do together, and we need to be people who do this earnestly. So that was the first year. in 1908. 1 year later, Father Paul, who was driven to witness to unity, said, well, you know what? We need to be the people who make the first move. So as a group of friars and sisters, they came into full corporate reunion with the Catholic Church. So there was a sense of full communion. That was a radical thing. That had not been done. That was the first time since the Reformation that two Christian groups had come together and said that they recognize one another in fullness of communion. And so it was a very powerful statement. If we don't sit together and talk about it, if there is no dialogue, there will be no peace. And so Father Paul kind of knew that intuitively. He saw, again, the divisions. So his main movement was for Christian unity, where even each day during the week of prayer, the octave, the 8 days, he would focus on a different tradition and how we could understand one another better. Now, while it wasn't as popular during his time, but all around that there was always, well, aren't there other people with whom we can speak? And today, in the week of prayer for Christian unity, even the day before is dedicated to dialogue with the Jews. Now we remember ecumenical means within the Christian tradition, and interreligious is with other people who are faithful to God but don't have the Christian understanding. So we have Christian-Jewish dialogue and we have Christian-Muslim dialogue. That is something that the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity and the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican promotes, but it's also things we promote within our community. We have different people in our community who work in those different dialogues and who promote that understanding. Father Paul's cause has just opened. It's been a process of study, but on September 22nd, Cardinal Dolan opened the cause. And you might ask, well, what is the cause for? What's really interesting is when the local church begins a cause, they start looking at the person and try to name that person, to make that person different. So first of all, it's Father Paul of Graymoor. And then what is the name that comes after that? The Apostle, which is wonderful, of unity and charity. So when you kind of begin the cause, it's more important to look at the local milieu, what's happening locally, and then you look at what's happening internationally, the two different levels of kind of recognition. So locally, Father Paul is obviously known for the Week of Prayer that then went and became a worldwide movement that continues today and continues to have impact on unity and dialogue, but also very locally. In the story of Father Paul coming to this mountain, this holy mountain, when he came here, he found all these very poor men who were traveling up and down Route 9 looking for work, basically working for the railroad or something, getting some kind of day labor. They were called hobos in those days. We kind of lost that term. But those men were living in St. John in the Wilderness Chapel we have down at the base of the hill. He said to them, look, you can't live in the church anymore. We're going to start using the church. Mother Lorraine and the sisters are going to live there. And then Father Paul moved into the paint shed. And then he took the chicken coop and put the men in. And what he did is he called those men Brothers Christopher, because they were men who brought Christ to us. And those men started helping him build different things on this mountaintop. But he also realized that they were suffering. They were suffering from needs, simple needs, food, housing. But then, more tragically, many of them were suffering from alcohol abuse in those days. So bit by bit, he took that little chicken coop and he made it bigger and bigger and bigger to what we have today as St. Christopher's Inn, which is a 180-bed treatment facility for men who are suffering from alcohol and drug abuse. In this local area, he's known very much for his work with the poor. And then he did crazy things. People gave us money, and he said, well, we shouldn't be keeping that. Let's put that aside, and we will give out money. So again, for Father Paul, it wasn't just about writing about it. Even though he started The Lamp, and it became one of the first religious magazines that went all over the United States, but he says, let's not just write about it, let's do something. So that's why they call him an apostle. He was a witness to God's action in this world, and he was able to make it come alive. So Father Paul's very, which you could say, small movement to simply go out of where you are, go out of your comfort zone, go out of your mind a little bit, to be open to the other, has allowed us to go to many different countries, to end up doing ministries in very many different places, be it from we even work with homeless people on the streets in Surumi in Japan, to having ecumenical centers and places where people can even learn English and study there, to simply being involved with homeless people in the United States, or running ecumenical libraries in Rome, which has now become the largest ecumenical library in Europe. So we've had an experience of being very small, but from this place, actually where we're sitting right now, it has irradiated over the whole world. One of the devotions that was very important to Father Paul was St. Anthony. And he believed that St. Anthony, like we all do, as soon as we lose something, we go running to St. Anthony. St. Anthony was someone who really listened to him, would pray with him. So there were so many moments in Father Paul's life where he believed miracles, simple miracles, came through St. Anthony, that he said, I need to help other people hear this story. I need to promote this culture. So he built the very first shrine to St. Anthony in the United States. And since that time, since the beginning of the community, there has been an ongoing novena here to St. Anthony. So we're going over 100 years that this has been continuing. So the site we're sitting in now, which is the St. Francis Chapel, was supposed to be a part of the shrine. But what happened to Father Paul is that as the money came in, when he saw great need, he kept saying, well, we really don't need to build a big giant building. And so he would send it off to the Middle East or to Japan or to the Philippines because he saw people hungry and did we need more brick and mortar. But what ended up happening is the biggest statue of St. Anthony that he could find, he put it in an outdoor shrine saying, wouldn't this be Franciscan? Wouldn't this be wonderful? And he built trees all around it, or set up trees all around it, so it has become an outdoor cathedral, where on St. Anthony Sunday, over 10,000 Haitians make a pilgrimage here. Maybe on the Sunday before or the Sunday afterwards, the Italians come, and they can come up to the same number. In the glory days, there were 60, 70 buses that were coming up here. This was such a pilgrimage site. People came here. They came here to see things like the altar behind me, which is from the spot where St. Francis received the stigmata. They came here to experience the shrine of St. Anthony. We have a Catholic bookstore, and we have the possibility to stay and go on retreat. And simply being on 400 acres where you can look down the Hudson and see New York City, it's just a beautiful place. For Father Paul, it reminded him of the place where Francis received the stigmata, La Verna, in Italy. And as he would stand on the mountaintop, exactly where his tomb is right now, it reminded him of the place where Francis received the stigmata. In other words, a place where God was known to have been and the power of God had transformed the world. So for him it was a very holy place, and for the thousands of men, the millions of men that have come through St. Christopher's Inn, this is called the Holy Mountain. This is the place where people come to meet God, spend some time alone with God, and grow in their sense of faith. I kind of think that Father Paul was about making places, spaces for dialogue to happen. And as it began within the church itself, we saw such commonality within who we are as Christians. And he got really inspired by something that was so important to Francis, that I go to meet the other and I go to encourage the faith in the other. I don't look at what the name of the faith is. Francis believed he was called to go bring faithfulness alive. In his story, when he was told that he wanted to be a knight, to go out and do all these things, and God comes to him in a dream, Jesus comes to him in a dream and says, if you leave that concept of war behind, I will give you the opportunity to have an army of people that will bring faith alive on this planet. And so Father Paul was so inspired by that, that he went to just encounter the faith in an individual and make it more alive. And then from that, we become faithful people who are sharing life together, and we walk together.